It is often said that Venus is the planet of relationships, romantic relationships, and relationships in general. So, when we talk about synastry, what is Venus and how do the other planets factor into relationships? You often hear about Venus being the significator and cardinal of relationships, which indeed is true. But then, does Mercury have something to do with that? Or, nah, you just need to look at that for finances and hanging out with friends. What about Saturn? What about Jupiter? So, today we're going to be talking on how all of the planets factor into romantic relationships and Vedic Synastry. So, let's start with Venus. Venus is a planet of desire, a planet of pleasure, of romance. So when you feel good, like when you wear some clothes like silk and it feels great, or you look in the mirror and you feel like you look beautiful, when you eat food and it's delicious, when someone is pouring love on you and you're like, yes, this is magnificent. That's Venus. Venus loves to feel good. And in many ways, you can say that in a chart, when we're talking about synastry, Venus has a lot to do with a person's love language, you could say. So, a little bit of an introduction. When it comes to looking at a man's chart, Venus will say a lot about how that man, um, about what type of women that man will be drawn to and like to attract. So, if a man has Venus in Aries, he's really going to be drawn to these very sexual, very passionate, kind of like spicy, independent sort of women who are ready and available at a moment's notice. They're super passionate and just, it's a very heated type of relationship that they want. Very passionate, right? Venus in Cancer, man, is going to want a woman who's a caretaker, a woman who is in some ways like a mother in the way that she's homey and comfortable and soft and kind, makes him feel safe, will hold him, will nourish him with food, take care of the house. Those kinds of things will be very appealing, right? So by looking at the sign and the house placement that Venus is in, you can really see in a man's chart what type of woman really resonates with them, what they're going to be drawn towards. So if you're a man, you can use this knowledge to have an understanding of the kind of woman that you're looking for. So if you're someone who has like a Venus in Cancer, and then you're considering dating a woman who's very mean, maybe a little bit harsh and stuff like that, you can pretty much rest assured that over the long term, that's something that's going to be harmful to you. Whereas someone who has Venus in Aries or Venus in Scorpio, might be able to like do that back and forth a bit better with that person who's a little more intense and passionate and maybe harsh. So in a female's chart, Venus has a lot to do with the way that a woman loves to express her romantic femininity. So if a woman has Venus in Cancer, she's going to like to be the homemaker. She's going to like to be kind and caring and compassionate and generous. At the same time, she's also going to want to have an environment where her needs are met. You know what I mean? She's not going to want to do that in a way where, she's then being treated badly. But that kind of energy is there. A woman who has Venus in Capricorn is going to be a very responsible type of wife. She's going to be, want a relationship where things make sense, where both partners are loyal, where they're able to build things together, a foundation, a life together. She's a very trustworthy type of woman, you know? So it's very important to understand when studying Venus in the chart that, the male-feminine dynamic is very significant in that. So Venus has a lot to do with the feel-good elements of the relationship. When you're together with your partner and you're both gazing into each other's eyes and you feel like there's a significant romantic connection happening there, a lot of that feel-good feeling is Venus. And so it's really important to note, when you're looking at two people's Venuses, like some ways you can kind of tell if they're compatible is by looking at the signs that they're in. So if say Venus is in Aries for one person and Venus is in Capricorn for another person, that's not as compatible because Aries is ruled by Mars and Capricorn is ruled by Saturn, and Saturn and Mars are not friends, right? Whereas when someone's Venus is in Taurus and someone's Venus is in Capricorn, that's a much better harmony because Taurus is ruled by Venus and Capricorn is ruled by Taurus, and Capricorn is ruled by Saturn, and Venus and Saturn are friends. So that's one way you can have an understanding of the compatibility of the Venusian energy. Because when the Venusian energy is good, there'll be that constant feel-good, pleasurable energy in the relationship. Now, in the West, that you could argue that that's a little overemphasized in marriage, whereas like in a lot of cultures in the East, there's like arranged marriages, and sometimes it doesn't, like that's not even the priority whether or not it like feels super great and romantic. They're actually getting married based on other priorities. But in the West, that's a very big priority for most people, is to have that pleasurable feeling. And so the Venus compatibility will show you whether or not that's there and whether or not it's sustainable. So another way to do this is to look at the house placement that Venus is in. So, look at the ascendant position. You can overlap both charts and then see, okay, this person's Venus is in, like where is your Venus in your partner's chart? You want to do this by house and by sign. Okay. So that means if your partner's Venus is in the 9th house and your Venus is in the 1st house, you could think about what the priority of that is and how compatible that is, right? But then also you want to do it by sign, which is, so like if Venus is in the sign of Aries for one person and Venus is in the sign of Gemini for another person, then no matter what house position they're in the charts, you look at how far away those planets are from each other by sign. So, Gemini is 3 places away from Aries by sign, as you can understand a lot of it by that nature as well. And then another important factor is, say one person has Venus in Gemini and the other person has K2 in Gemini. So even though we're not talking about that other person's Venus, the K2 in Gemini energy will affect the person who has Venus in Gemini, because the part of their auras, which the Gemini energy is where that's residing, one person will have K2 in that energy, the other person will have Venus. So the Venus person will be wanting to find pleasure and nourishment and fun and joy through the Gemini energy, from that energy, and the other person will feel detached from that position, from that type of energy. And so therefore that'll be a harder mix. Now, there are ways to even merge those kinds of energies when you understand truly what the nature of K2 is. That is a much longer discussion. So these are just a few pointers. Oh, one other thing about Venus. You want to look at the signs which Venus rules in each chart. So Libra and Taurus, and you see in each person's chart what houses Venus and Taurus are in, or Libra and Taurus are in, and what planets are in those signs and aspecting those signs. And that will influence Venus as well. So we're going to make a longer video discussing these things much more in depth, but this is meant to be a kind of introduction just to give you some things to look at in your chart. You're like, okay, I'm looking at Venus in my chart, looking at it in my partner's chart. Here are just a few points where I can begin to analyze it and see how these energies merge together. And a lot of it, you want to look at the planetary friendships and relationships is really important to this. You can look up on Google Vedic astrology, like what planets are friends with other planets. Okay. And that will give you an insight on how to tell how the harmonies are going. There's more to it than this, but this is just an introduction. So now that we've discussed that briefly, let's talk about the other planets. So how do they influence and affect romantic relationships? Well, from the moon position, you can see how emotionally available you and your partner are. So from the moon, like say you want comfort from your partner, had a hard day at work or something's going on, you come to your partner, you want emotional support. The kind of emotional support that your partner is capable of giving you in terms of comfort, in terms of making you feel home, it's safe and nourished, you can see from the moon. So moon in Cancer people, they're going to be highly supportive, highly nourishing, highly comforting whenever someone comes to them for emotional support. Whereas moon in Capricorn people will be more like, you should really be able to handle this emotional thing yourself. Like, you should be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I have to handle my emotions on my own. No one was around to help and baby me all the time. So you're going to have to learn to grow up, be a little tough, and learn how to handle that. All right. So there are other things in the chart which contribute to these factors. Also, you got to look at the Navamsha chart as well to see the person's fundamental moon energy. Look at the Cancer placement. Look at the 4th house, for example. But these are very, very important dynamics that from the moon position, you will see, well, this is the type of support that my partner is able to offer me in terms of comfort. Now, even in the case of the moon and Capricorn person, that may be their way of trying to emotionally support you by saying, hey, if you're able to, like, stuff happens, if you're able to toughen up, you won't have to feel so sad in the future. To them, that might be the way that they're trying to help, right? Or they may just not have emotional space, depending on what else is going on in their chart. They may just be like, you know what, I ain't got time for this. You gotta have to work on this yourself, all right? Or I'm a little bit, I don't really have that much energy to give you when it comes to needing all this comfort and support. So knowing that is very, very key, all right? And then seeing how compatible the moon signs are, both by sign, like we were talking about before, as well as by house position. So if like the two people's moons are really far away from each other, like one person's moon is like 6 spaces away, then you're really 6 spaces away, 8 spaces away, 12 spaces away, they say, then it's going to be a little bit harder to get that understanding. But if it's 2 places away, 4 places away, then you're going to see a lot more nourishment, a lot more care when it comes to that. Now, interestingly, this is a bit of something I'm still trying to figure out, so I'm just going to go ahead and say this outright, is that a lot of times when I've studied this, when they talk about like how far these planets are away from each other, I'm going to figure this out eventually, but you have to bear with me the fact that I don't know this for sure yet, so I'm just going to say it, is that I don't know how much in the text they mean when they say doing it by house or by sign. I think it might be both. So like, for example, like no matter what sign is in somebody's first house, you might just look at, okay, my moon is in the 2nd house, my partner's moon is in the 4th house, right? Just based on each person's chart. And or it might be doing it by sign, which is that, well, say one person's moon is in the 4th house and another person's moon is in the 9th house, but one of them, the first person's moon is in Leo and the second person's moon is in Virgo, which means that it's 2 spaces away and 12 spaces away, depending on which partner's looking at it, by sign, and then by house, it's that far away, right? So that is something to kind of play with, and I'm like kind of working on understanding a bit more. So that's kind of a progress and development thing. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that it's probably valuable to look at both of those things, but definitely by house. So Mercury has a lot to do with how the communication between two people will go. So when you're sitting down, you just have to communicate with your words, because there are people who communicate without words. They have that moon connection, they kind of communicate emotionally. They barely need to say anything to each other. Or when they do say something, it's just completely understood and integrated. They got well-placed moons and Jupiters. But Mercury has to do with a lot of this kind of verbal, intellectual communication. And so, you can see by the harmonies of each person's Mercury whether or not their communication styles are compatible, whether or not there might be some conflict there, and just how that kind of goes. Now, keep in mind that 2 people could have arguments, with the Mercuries not being super compatible. They might misunderstand each other with words, but their moons and things might be so aligned that it really doesn't bother them. They have a little, verbal scuffle, and they're like, no big deal. But another chart, it might be the Mercuries are just only slightly misaligned, but every time they have an argument, even if it's just a little argument, it emotionally impacts them so much it's a massive deal because of the way their moons are positioned, right? So that's very important to note too. But yes, Mercury has to do with the communication. Also has a lot to do with like if you're just like hanging out with your spouse, you're just hanging out. Can you two have fun together? Can you have witty banter? Can you make jokes? Are you this type of couple that can like hang out and play video games or hang out and go to an event together? So like another way you can understand Mercury is say you and your partner went on a road trip together, or you went on a running a bunch of errands together, short distance travel. How well does that vibe? How well do you two synchronize with each other? How fun is that for you? You can see that kind of stuff through Mercury. So Mars, a lot of us know, has a lot to do with sexuality. So this is a lot of fun, very important for a lot of people. In the East, maybe not so important. A lot of times there's people who are in marriages and who are completely celibate, and that's not as emphasized. Here in the West, though, those Venus-Mars elements are super emphasized. That comes with our like cultural romantic dialogue. So, Mars has to do with sexual compatibility. Like, how does a person like to sexually express themselves? What is it that they like? What is it that they don't like? All right. So, a lot of like astrologers, when you study the Mars compatibility, you'll hear them talk about whether or not a person is Mongolic, which has to do with Mars being in certain houses. I'm going to have to do a video on that separately because, I want to kind of do an overview here. But so for the purpose of this video, we're just going to talk about Mars in the context of like sign and house placements. And so like Mars, say someone has Mars in Aries, this person will be very direct in sexuality. They might walk up to somebody that they've met just for the first time and be like, let's have sex. You know what I mean? Like they're just like, yeah, let's just do it. Let's do it right now. They're very direct. They're very passionate. They're very impulsive. And they may or may not have an emotional connection to the people that they have sex with, depending on other things going on in the chart and what phase of life that they're in. Whereas, a Mars and Cancer person, they're going to have a much more emotional neediness and connection at play when they have sex. Even if they act like that's not the case, when they have sex with someone, it's going to be very emotional, very sentimental. It might bring up a lot of past feelings and traumas and sadnesses for them. They might cry. They might want to cry, but they might not cry. There's a lot of emotions involved with sexuality. Right? There's like sexuality has a lot to do with getting their emotional needs met, feeling safe, feeling comforted. There's a lot of sensitivity there, right? Mars and Scorpio, very kinky. Mars and Scorpio is very passionate, very intense, can often be possessive. They might like BDSM. They might like, dirty talk and intense language and things like that. So, the Mars and Scorpio, it's like that, a little bit of Addams Family type of sexuality there. It's very kind of dark and passionate and lustful and, maybe a bit, edgy and stuff like that. So this is, to give you an idea of the way that Mars affects a person's sexual style. All right, there's obviously a lot more placements that we can cover. I'm going to do specific videos on each of these things. I'm just trying to give you an overview of the different planets right now, so don't worry, there's a lot more to come. So, you can kind of see that. And then, of course, in the house placement has a similar dynamic to where, Mars in the 4th house is going to struggle more with sexuality. Mars in the 12th house is extremely sexual and will just, they can often have sex with many, many, many people. They're very, they don't have very many boundaries when it comes to having sex. And so oftentimes, like, they'll be the people with like the highest amount of people that they've slept with. But also they can have, very deep astral connections when having sex with people. They can have astral sex at certain higher levels if they train with that or if they have a knack for it. And they can very easily like merge with someone spiritually and astrally through like having sex with them. Although at the same time, they can also be very detached from the people they have sex with to where it almost doesn't matter at all. So that's very important to understand. And Mars in the 1st house, like when they have sex, it'll kind of be like, we're doing it my way. We're doing it my way or it's the highway. You want to have sex the way I want to have it, or you could just go find somebody else because I ain't got time for that. You know what I mean? So houses and the signs both matter. Aspects matter. All that stuff is very, very important with Mars. So Saturn has a lot to do with the commitments that a person is able to make. So you can see what a person is here to work on in this lifetime in terms of their karma, in terms of their actions that they have to perform. Um, and you can also see just like their commitment style. So like when someone makes a commitment, I am going to do this thing and I'm going to stand by what I've said forever. You can see that with Saturn. So if someone has Saturn in Aries, they might make a commitment. They might over time be very, very annoyed or frustrated with their commitments. It might actually kind of burden them. They might just be like, oh, I want to do this thing and my responsibilities are getting in my way, right? Whereas someone who has Saturn in Libra, they're really good at balancing their commitments and their responsibilities. They're like, okay, I made this commitment. All right, I'm going to stick by this. I'm going to balance this thing and this thing and this thing in my life in order to make sure that I can fulfill all of these commitments simultaneously. Um, so, it also has a lot to do with the responsibilities which we are able to adopt and meant to adopt and willing to adopt. Okay. So, relationships and marriages, there's a lot of responsibility that comes there. All right. Like I said, a lot of people want to talk about Venus, but Saturn has a lot to do with relationships, which is also why he's exalted in the seventh house of Libra, which is the house of marriage, because marriage is a contract. It's responsibility. You say, okay, I am agreeing and consenting to say only have sex with you and you're only going to have sex with me. We're going to be together for our lives and make a life together. That's a commitment. And then 30, 40 years later, you're still keeping that commitment. That's a lot to do with Saturn. And so you can also see a lot about the maturity of a person through Saturn, you know, and how mature they are, what they need to become mature, what their journey to maturation is like. A lot of people out here, especially in the West, they're dating people and they're not very mature, and they're like, man, like why I feel like I'm dating all these kids. It's like, well, take a look at Saturn, take a look at where the Capricorn and Aquarius signs are, and you'll kind of get an understanding of what's going on there. You see someone who has Saturn in the first house, Saturn Moon conjunction, Saturn Sun conjunction, they're generally going to be more mature, okay? Especially Saturn in the first house, like these people, they're mature like as little kids, right? But at the same time, they might not be as emotionally, available or just as easily able to kind of melt and be emotional and vulnerable and connect with you. They might just be like, look, man, I had to do all this stuff. You're going to have to do it too. You know what I mean? Work on this thing. So understand that the maturity of Saturn can also sometimes have that effect of being a little bit cold and dry, like is the nature of Saturn. But strongly placed Saturns, like Saturn in Libra, you see Saturn in the seventh house, stuff like that, very strongly indicating that that person is going to be loyal in relationships, right? Whereas other placements like Saturn in the eighth can be an indication for getting a divorce. So it's very, very important to understand, what's happening with Saturn in that respect. So the sun is very fascinating, actually. And, when it comes to relationships, the sun is our soul. It's Atman. All right. So, when two people have suns that are very, very compatible, they'll often feel like soulmates. And, this is something I'm still doing more research on, but my initial meditations on this and some of the things that I've observed when doing synastry readings thus far is that when people's suns are really deeply connected and compatible, they can have this feeling of being very deeply bonded, being soulmates, maybe like they're meant to be together. Even sometimes you can have this like we've known each other before feeling, even though a lot of times you can also see that through K2, which is like people who like date people from their past lives and stuff like that. You like Venus conjunct K2, K2 in the seventh house, K2 in Libra. You can date people who you've known in other lifetimes and stuff like that. But the sun also has a lot to do with this kind of also like destiny relationships, this feeling like we were destined to be together. It's because the souls are uniting and merging. So, there can be people who have lifelong marriages, but they never felt like they were like soulmates with that person. That was their duty. That was their responsibility. They fulfilled that. Everything was good. Like a lot of religious marriages, arranged marriages, no problem, right? When you have that like kind of movie style romance where it's like, we were meant to be together. A lot of times you'll see those suns really deeply merging in the chart. And another cool thing about the suns when they're really in sync in synastry is that you're able to really feel on the deepest levels that you are able to be authentically yourself with your romantic partner. Like you're able to be authentically yourself and your partner is able to effortlessly merge in with that. You don't have to be anything other than who you truly intrinsically are. And that's a wonderful, wonderful feeling. And so this brings us to Jupiter, planet of higher wisdom, guru, knowledge, and spiritual connection and communion. So, of course, many of you probably know that Jupiter in a woman's chart is the significator for the husband. All right. So, whereas Venus is the significator for the wife in a male's chart, Jupiter is the significator for a husband in a woman's chart. And so, when the Jupiter are really well aligned, like the woman's Jupiter is good and the male's Jupiter really syncs with that, and his Jupiter and his wisdom is in good position, you'll have this traditional relationship dynamic that can come about where like a woman can be submissive and feel like that's a good thing because the guidance of the man is wise. It's not a selfish thing. It's not coming from a taking advantage of someone kind of place. It's really coming from this higher plane of wisdom. The male is able to be something like a teacher and a guide for the female. Now, of course, this can also work in, like where the woman is a guru for the man as well. Since we're talking about, in that specific instance, we're talking about Jupiter being the significator for a husband, that's a big part of why. And that's something that I'm looking forward to doing a lot of videos about is, like gender roles and how planets play into that and female submission and male submission and different types of ways that relationships work. But definitely talking about the traditional archetype of the male leader and guide and the female submissive support and how like the divine expression of that, not the oppressive version that we see from the 1950s that the feminist movement is the antithesis to. And the feminist movement has both its positive and negatives as well, things that it needs to work on and understand about, gender roles and how yin and yang energies merge together. But there is a divine expression of that works very, very well. And of course, the reason why it works well when it does is because of Jupiter, right? Which means that the male isn't operating from his lower ego. He's operating from the place of divine knowledge. That's beyond his ego, right? So for that to work, where a female submits to a man, and that man is a righteous husband who's leading and guiding, he's actually operating from a place of kind of a divine consciousness that is not selfish. So Jupiter is in a chart really has to do with a person's also has to do with a person's comprehension and understanding, their wisdom. Okay, so is a person wise? When you're looking at your partner, this is something that's very, very important to understand, especially for a woman, to look at her chart, look at her Jupiter, and see what's happening with that before she thinks about getting married. When you have Jupiter afflictions, that's, especially in a woman's chart, that's very, very difficult when it comes to marriage. When you have great, well-positioned Jupiters, like Jupiter in Cancer, like basically Jupiter in the water signs and Jupiter in the fire signs is generally good, and Jupiter in the air signs and Jupiter in the earth signs is more challenging, right? Just in general. But of course, each specific planetary energy and sign, or each specific sign energy in relationship to Jupiter is something we can get into. That's like a quick, easy beginning thing to look into. But Jupiter aspects and conjunctions are so important, so important in a female's chart. So it's definitely one of the first things you should look at. And just in general too, like say you're looking at a partner and you're like, well, can I trust this person? Can I trust them to be wise? Can I trust them to act in a way that's benevolent and to have my best interests at heart? You really got to look at Jupiter to see the wisdom of a person. So when you're looking at synastry in general, it's so important to be able to understand like what that person's higher level of comprehension is like, because when you marry someone, you generally want them to be operating from a higher space of consciousness to really, if there's something happening, whether it's something in the marriage or something in the world they need to deal with, whatever it is, something in their personal life, Are they able to operate from a high plane and gain high knowledge and say, you know what, I'm not going to be clouded by things that are going on down here. I see the way through this. Here's the wise way of handling this. These are the kind of things you see from Jupiter. And when they're synced up really, really well, then you see two people who can grow together spiritually. You see people who can grow together in terms of wisdom. You see people who are able to truly understand each other on a deep level and in a very comprehensive way. So we talked about Mercury being communication and whether or not two people are able to kind of intellectually understand each other. But to really like deeply understand each other, you need that Jupiter synastry working well. Okay. And so this brings us to Rahu. Rahu. Oh goodness. So Rahu in somebody's chart really shows what they crave. What's the insatiable part of themselves? What is the shadow that they're struggling with? So when you're looking at a synastry and you're like, okay, like where is that spicy bit? Where is that shenanigan part of a person? It's where they might be willing to break some boundaries, to break some taboos. They might be willing to cut corners in some place. Got to look at Rahu. All right. That's the shadow of a person. All right. Where's that cunning part that's like, I'm going to do this for my own advantage. You know, I'm going to do this over here. Right. That's important to note. Someone who has Rahu in, you know, the 7th house has to be particularly aware of whoever it is they're dating, right? Whoever it is they're dating, they have to be very, very conscious of that because they can attract someone who seems like they're one way, but really they got some other stuff going on that they weren't telling you about. That's one thing that can happen with that. Now, on the positive end of that, that could be a very cunning partner, someone who's very, magnetic and seductive and attractive, and someone who's like just kind of hypnotizing in the way like, wow, this person is gorgeous and special in some way. They'll be wanting to be drawn to those kinds of people. But the integrity of that person, if you have Rahu in the 7th house and you're trying to date somebody, because that means that you're attracting people who have that Rahu nature, since it's in your 7th house. You have to be so discerning about that person's level of integrity, both in the present and through the span of time, because there's going to be a lot of temptations in that person to do things, and making sure that they behave honestly in all of their circumstances in life will be something that's very important for you to be aware of, and for that person to be aware of, because it's going to take a conscious kind of effort to do that. But basically, you can kind of see from Rahu in anybody's chart, like where they're going to be tempted. Rahu in the 10th house people, they're tempted to abuse status. Okay, you actually see like a lot of political figures who have Rahu in the 10th house, and then they get up into this position of status, and they're like, well, I'm gonna start doing all this crap. I'm gonna cheat to maintain my position. I might cut this corner, like whatever. Like they can abuse positions of power, right? Rahu in the 7th house, because it's about breaking taboos among other things. So like Rahu in the 7th house, they might be willing to cheat on their partner. They might be willing to be like, yeah, I'm just willing to cross this line. Like, what lines is a person willing to cross? So that's really the challenge. Is like, it's not saying that someone will do those things, but the temptation to and the ability to will likely be there, especially until their Rahu matures at the age of 42. Okay, so something to be very, very aware of is to just be aware of people's shadow. Everybody has to overcome Rahu in this way. Now, of course, Rahu gives people stuff. If you got Rahu like in the 11th house, you're probably making a lot of money. You're probably making bank. You know what I mean? So, Rahu gives you stuff. Like people who have Rahu in the 10th house, they do tend to rise in their careers often. But the challenge is, how do I not abuse this thing? How do I not take a shortcut to take advantage of this in a way that's not honest, right? And just keep in mind that Rahu is here to tempt us, and among other things, like he gives us stuff too. There's positive elements, but that by doing those temptations and those shortcuts and those things that are illegal and stuff like that, you can end up racking up a lot of karma for yourself. So it's very, very important to note that even if you steal something, you have to pay that back in one way or another eventually. It's not like you might get away with it in terms of going to court, but it doesn't mean you got away with it cosmically. So this brings us to K2, and K2 shows K2 is complex and misunderstood. It's a lot to get into, actually. So I almost just want to be like, let me just make a whole video about this, but I'm going to try to at least give something, but just understand that K2 is so complex and mysterious that, there's way more to it than this thing that I'm going to be talking about. So, like, one of the things that we talk about with K2 is detachment. All right. So, if someone, like, you can see where a person is kind of detached because they've mastered something in their past life. They've had a lot of whatever that thing is, and they're like, okay, I need to do a little bit of a fast from that thing so I can develop some other areas of my being, so I can balance my karmas better, et cetera, right? So K2 can show a level of detachment from um, things in somebody's life. So, like, for example, if somebody has, Venus and Sun in the seventh house, and their partner has K2 in their seventh house, that might be difficult to pair those two things because their partner is detached in the area where they have a lot of need for things. They need to have the seventh house connection, and their partner is like, no input. You really can't connect with me here in this way, in this very attached way. You can't connect to me in that way. You have to be a little bit detached when you're in a relationship with me in a certain sense. So that's very important understanding that wherever a person has K2, whatever sign and whatever house, you're going to have this bit of a no input energy. Rahu is like all the input. He's like, gimme, nom, 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 nom. He's just eating constantly. He's like super yin. So that person's going to want energy to flow into that spot, flow into that spot, flow into that spot constantly. But K2 is the opposite. He's like, nah, I've had so much of this. It's like, when you're full and like when you're hungry and starving, you're like, give me all the food, all of it right now in my belly. Give it all to me. All right. K2 is like when you're full and you've eaten 15 courses and you're like, listen, I cannot eat another bite. If you were to put that food in front of me, I might gag. Like, I've had enough. All right. That's kind of what K2 is like. So it's very important to understand where your partners and where your K2 is at so that you understand where that level of detachment is. Now, with that said, I did say K2 is complicated. So, like, for example, K2 will often detach in a way where, you know, he's trying to make sure you're not attached to things in an energetic way. And he'll often try to phase out material things, but he can give things too, depending on whether or not that thing is spiritual. It helps you to attain moksha. So, for example, K2 in the seventh house can show someone who doesn't have a desire for relationships, who doesn't want to get married, and they're a nun or a monk for their whole life. Or it can show someone who gets married to someone who's a transcendentalist, and that person is helping them to achieve moksha. Right now, if that person with K2 in the seventh house just wanted to marry somebody and live a happy attached life in a picket fence, and have a very like attached type of romance, K2's like, sorry, you're not meant to have that in this lifetime. You've done that enough. You're gonna have to work on something else. But if they're able to have this kind of spiritually detached, like non-attached type of marriage where, they're like, we're married so that we can grow closer to God, so we can achieve liberation from samsara. That actually might work. You hear marriages in India where, they like don't have sex because they're celibate so that they can achieve a higher plane of consciousness. So those kinds of marriages you can see more with K2. You can also see this person gets into relationships with and marries people who they knew in past lives, who they were kind of meant to be with. Like, they're not allowed to be in any of these, like, they're single for long periods of time, and then boom, lightning bolt strikes, and like, I'm supposed to be with this person, right? And so then they go and they're with that person. But then even in that case, maybe it's only meant to be for a period of time. Maybe then they have to learn to let go of even that person. Like, now I have to learn non-attachment again. I was destined to be with this person, but it doesn't mean I was destined to be with them for my entire life. I have to let them go now. Okay. So K2 is very, very important. Rahu and K2 both add a lot of dynamism to a chart. And so when you have those, like you have a Venus Rahu placement, K2 Rahu or K2 Venus placement, that's going to change a lot. It's like the K2 Venus, for example. You might have somebody who, on the one hand, it's like, I don't need a relationship. Like they might say they don't need a relationship. They don't feel like they need romance. They feel like they're fine by themselves, no problem. But then that might just wobble in some way to where then the next minute they're like, or sometime later, they're like, I love this person to the extremes of the universe. I want to be with them for lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes. I want to transcend the realms with this person, you know, and I can't think of being with anybody else. Those are the kinds of dynamics. It kind of goes from fasting to extreme sometimes. So like K2 can be an extreme of something, or it can be a fast from something. Like K2 in the second house can make a person like a master at not eating food. Like you have someone who like fasts for long periods of time, but they just don't eat. K2 in the second house can give somebody that power. All right. Whereas Rahu in the second house is like all the food now. Just like constantly eating. They're eating. It's like a Dragon Ball Z or, you know, like an anime character who's like eats bowl after bowl after bowl after bowl after bowl. That's like Rahu in the second house. Whereas K2 in the second house is like, it's like, when was the last time you ate? It's like, I ate a grain of rice 2 weeks ago. You know what I mean? So like, that's the kind of thing you can see from that. So just understand like how that will play out in a chart. So this is the introductory element to, you know, introductory video to how planets, how all of the planets influence our relationships and influence synastry in the Vedic system. So there is so much more to be said about these topics, and I'm very, very excited to get into it even more with you. So if you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. And we're going to talk a lot more on this very soon. Take care.